Okay. All right, thanks for coming, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about running a good and beautiful design business in Asia. And that's what it says here in Chinese. That image here is from Haw Par Villa in Singapore, one of my favorite places. It's a vintage heritage site in Singapore. Was built in the 30s and was very popular in the 60s and 70s before you had TVs and malls. And it's a place that deals a lot with Chinese mythology. And I love this place, and I go there very often to take photos, and I'm using the photos from Haw Par Villa to illustrate some of my points in my presentation. And so basically what I want to talk about is what my journey was coming to Asia, what the advantages are to be there, what kind of learnings I have from having run a business in Asia, and maybe what kind of opportunities there are for people, for example, if you want to run your own business, for entrepreneurs, as a market, and so forth. So basically I'm going to be looking at some numbers, some digital content creation facts in the region, my personal journey, and opportunities. And in terms of opportunities, as I said, I don't only mean opportunities as an entrepreneur, but also as an outsourcing destination as well, as a market, and and as a resource for talent as well. So as I said, I run a business in Singapore called studiocgartist.com. Yesterday I had a talk about a book I put out recently here, Unreal for Mobile and Standalone VR. It's focused on Unreal production for Android-based HMDs, and so there was a talk specifically on VR production. But with my business in Singapore, I basically work with a partner network. These are people I've very often known for more than 20 years. And on the side, I try to establish my own IP. I try to develop my own intellectual property. The focus of my business so far has been B2B VR, which means basically educational VR applications, product design, review apps, 3D visualization, that kind of thing. And but as a small business in Asia, has always been important for me to be flexible. As once you're outside of your home turf, you have to be able to quickly pivot to different directions, and you have to be able to keep your fingers in a lot of pies, so to say. So I had a large variety of jobs I was doing while I've been in Asia. I've been in Asia for 13 years, and the jobs I've been doing was 3D visualization, game assets, prototyping, enterprise, and even up to custom wall art for business lobbies, so anything like related to 3D and digital art. So I've been covering a very diverse field of jobs. And Singapore is a great place to run a business, I believe. It has a good strategic geographical advantage because there is an ecosystem with high-profile digital entertainment companies. You have all the big players there, like Ubisoft, Lucas, Disney, Discovery Channel, like all the big players are there, and and you have an ecosystem of companies that support the ecosystem. You have a vibrant startup community. There's a lot of medtech and fintech companies, and as you have this startup community, that startup community creates sort of a specific kind of entrepreneurial spirit, and that helps you to network and to find other people to cooperate. And the other point is it's a stable political and economic climate with a strong academic sector. I mean, stable is super important. Like if you look at Southeast Asia, some of these countries are not stable. Look at Thailand, there's always trouble. And it has been, Singapore has been super, predictable, and it's a very stable politically climate there. And the strong academic sector is actually good for sometimes for funding. You get good funding for projects in the academic field, but also for talent. There's always good talent coming through the academic sector. By the way, this is another picture here from Haw Villa. Here's another one. And some numbers concerning the games market in Southeast Asia. The games market will generate 4.6 billion in 2019, up 22% year on year, which, that's 22% is a lot of growth. But it is only 3.1% of the total games market in 2019. That's also something to consider, but it is the fastest growing market. So the whole region is growing extremely fast. 2/3 of the region's game revenues come from mobile, compared to 24% on PC and just 9% on console. So mobile is obviously the most dynamic sector. Some numbers that I find interesting in terms of digital content creation, animation. The average salaries in Southeast Asia animation industry range from 500 to 2,000 per month. So, if you look at the neighboring countries, for example, in the Philippines, is probably the cheapest country. It's like it can go as low as $300. And the more expensive one is, for example, is Thailand, where where the salaries are definitely higher. Singapore is definitely above the average. It usually starts around 3,000. The majority of companies, over 57%, have only been established in the last 6 years, which is kind of interesting. So it's a pretty young industry of especially the outsourcing sector. And the nature of work is mostly 3D animation, 2D, for cell shading, visual effects, and a lot of 3D assets. I actually traveled around in the region for outsourcing projects, and there's a bunch of really good companies that produce assets for game companies. So regarding my own personal journey, here's kind of like an overview over my milestones here. I had a company originally in Hamburg called C&T Media that was established in 1997, and I was originally cooperating with a company in Hamburg called Pixel Film. We were doing corporate videos, image films, and then only in 2002 I became more serious about 3D, and I was getting more and more into 3D animation, and then I was actually producing tutorial DVDs around that time. And then in 2006, I started a sub-company, a subdivision called Emerging Entertainment, and that was actually moved to Asia in 2006, to Singapore. And in 2010, the company was moved from Singapore to Phnom Penh. And then in 2005, I liquidated that company and opened a new company in Singapore called Studio CG Artist. And that's where I'm still today. And that has been 13 years. So originally how I got started in this whole thing was, as I said, around 2002, I started to produce these tutorial DVDs. I actually used to advertise in digital production for anyone who was around at that time. I advertised in digital production for these tutorial DVDs. They covered Lightwave even back then, Maya, Flash, After Effects. And that was actually a nice little business. I had a steady revenue from that. Each DVD cost about 50 euros. And so around that time, 2002 until 2005, that label under cgartist.com was this label was called CG Artist Software Training. That generated a good revenue for me, and that revenue allowed me to develop my concepts. I actually my goal was to develop a game concept, action adventure game, and that this money from the tutorial DVDs was able to support that. And then in 2006, there was this time when there was a huge game investment hype. And all of a sudden, like, there was this big craze, like investors were really excited about the games market. So people were saying like, oh, I want to invest in games. All these banker types had investors, people with money who wanted to get into games. And everyone was super excited. This is a market of the future. We want to get in. Do you have anything? Let me see your concept. So, and I just happened to be at the right time with the right concept. And I was in the middle of this huge hype, and I had a good pitch, and I pitched my game concept, and I got funded at that time. So I got some seed money. It was 1.6 million, and with that project, I moved to Singapore. And so in 2006, I was able to put money into this project I've been developing. It was called Troll in Armor, an action-adventure title that was actually based on the Gamebryo engine. Gamebryo was a popular engine at that time. For example, was used for titles like Oblivion, The Elder Scrolls, Civilization 4 by Sid Meier, and a bunch of other popular titles. The advantage of the Gamebryo engine at that time was that it was multi-platform, so you could do PC, you could do Xbox and PlayStation. So multi-platform engine, but it was not as nice as in these days Unreal. It was really technical. It was more for people who used to write their own engines. And so basically it was a bunch of libraries and editor, and was pretty technical. But the other thing that was kind of interesting was the venture capital, and my investors, they had two requirements for this for funding the project. And the first condition was really bizarre. It was that the game had to be free of violence. And that was really weird, because the concept of the game was an action-adventure title with a lot of combat. So we had a weapon system. We had all the technology, all the assets were already designed for combat. And the mocap we had already done was all towards action-adventure. But the problem was my investors, they had no idea about games. They had never played a game in their life. They have never held a game controller in their hands. These people were absolutely clueless about what games are about, basically, right? So they were really paranoid about the bad reputations like first-person shooters have. So they were really paranoid about like this bad image rubbing off on them. So there was this paranoia about being involved in like some first-person shooter type of game, and that's why they put this bizarre condition in there. And that condition actually created a lot of confusion in my team, because we didn't know how to deal with that at first, because we thought like, what do we do now? I mean, we have to change the game concept, obviously. And then there was a question like, what actually is violence? Where does violence start? Like, is kicking a dwarf violence? Is slapping an elf? Is that violence? What about verbal violence? So there was a lot of discussion and confusion, and it kind of slowed down development. It was kind of a weird time. And the other one was the production must be in Singapore, for some reason, I don't know, tax and other reasons. And at that time, I was very happy with my team in Hamburg. had a small team in Hamburg. Everything was great. I was very comfortable in Hamburg. I had a super good time. I was really no reason for me to move to Singapore at that point. And but in the end, I thought, okay, I'm going to go along with this adventure. Why not? Take this opportunity. Let's see what comes out of it. So I went along, and then the game production that, as I said, was an action fantasy adventure, was story driven. There was a huge backstory to it. And the game design document was like this thick. It was like massive with lots of assets, big worlds. And that's why we needed a lot of outsourcing partners. So I went to, I traveled to a lot of outsourcing destinations, China, Philippines, Thailand, visited all these companies. And we actually also outsourced to the US. And I've always been a big fan of Blur Studios. And so I wanted Blur Studios to do the concept art for it because I'm such a fan of Blur Studios, and also I wanted to be able to brag about it, characters designed by Blur. And so I went to meet Tim Miller for lunch in Santa Monica, and I visited Blur, and it was really interesting. So they designed the character lineup. So actually in the beginning this game was actually called Azenta before the name was changed to Troll in Armor. And so basically the idea was to be in Singapore as a headquarter, and then have a lot of outsourcing partners to be able to produce this massive game. And then by 2008, everything was shaping up really nicely. I had like a staff of 20 people. The game design document was finally finished. It was, like, as I said, this thick, but it had all the game mechanics. Everything was in there. Everything worked. We had the pipeline established. And actually, we had a vertical slice delivered, a demo that showed all the features of the game, a playable level. And we went in talks with distribution partners. We had a pretty good relationship with Electronic Arts in Singapore. And it was a great time, it was absolutely fantastic. Everything came together. It was absolutely awesome. And we had a beautiful office in Chinatown in Singapore. And everything was absolutely awesome, except in 2008, all of a sudden there was something else happened, and there was the financial crisis all of a sudden. The financial crisis, and that financial crisis hit really hard. Especially in emerging markets. And at that time, as I said earlier, a lot of the game productions were financed with financial instruments because as a result of the big hype in game financing. So a lot of game funds that came through investment funds were involved in the gaming industry, and that meant that the gaming industry was specifically hit very hard. And it was really a tough time. And the purge happened, from 2008 even until 2013. A lot of companies went under. Some notable examples were Tentacles from Germany. It was a company that went public in 2006. They had like the Michael Schumacher series. They had a big office in Singapore, and there was a very ambitious lineup there. And there was Kcetera Gameworks, also a pretty big setup they were producing a fantasy role-playing game based on the book, the game role-playing book, Lone Wolf. Mikuishi, a large local game developer, also doing a MMORPG. And Real You was also a German-based operation by DTP Publishing. There was a publisher that did a lot of adventure titles and kids games. Great company, actually. They had a huge investment in Singapore. Like in the beginning, it was 80 people. I think later it was up to 300 people, 40 million investment. So really, a lot of money went into there, and all these companies really totally disappeared. And that was the result of the financial crisis. So, and for me, it was the same thing. I was hit really hard. So my investors, they pulled out from one day to the other. And that was a weird moment because they left me with all obligations. So I had like a huge financial obligations there. I had like a financial overhead of 150,000 a month. And I, in Singapore, I'm liable in front of the law, and I don't want to end up in jail, right? So basically, I had to deal with these obligations, and I was the person responsible. So that was really tough to deal with that. But in the end, I managed. All bills were paid, but it was a tough time. And then in 2010, I decided, okay, I'm gonna make a change. I'm going to move the company from Singapore to Phnom Penh. And the reason why I wanted to do that was I needed a break, first of all. And then I also wanted to move operations to a country with lower cost. But I wanted to have emerging entertainment as a legal entity, of course, to be continued, because I have a lot of licenses and a lot of assets that were attached to the company. So I needed to transfer all that. So, and in Cambodia, that was, of course, a completely different scenario for me, completely different environment, but it was an exciting time at that time. And so in Cambodia, I started to do completely different jobs, even though it was still emerging entertainment. But I was, at that time, I was looking, hey, what can I do here? What with the knowledge and the assets that I have. So I got involved with some nonprofits and NGOs, did some help them with their visual communication, did animation projects for them. I was also started to teach part-time at Lim Kok Wing University, and so it was a really interesting time for me. And at that time, I really got into virtual reality, something that was possible because I had actually more time in Cambodia to focus on virtual reality. I was teaching virtual reality at Lim Kok Wing University, and I had enough time to experiment with storytelling ideas and UX, so basically the new opportunities that you have with the new medium. And for that reason, that was a super interesting time for me to kind of explore new things. And then in 2014, I noticed that VR all of a sudden was becoming more interesting for the general public. So all of a sudden I noticed there was more media coverage. So people were approaching me, I had like a huge spread in the local newspaper. There was a lot of interest in VR all of a sudden. So I was probably the only guy in Cambodia that had a development kit. So and people always came up to me, said like, "Oh, what are you doing?" And journalists approached me, and I was covered on TV and on the local newspapers. And then people noticed investors were interested, and there was demand for concepts. People asked me, "Show me what you have. What do you want to do and stuff?" So I noticed it was time to move on because I needed a better business environment to get to the next stage in VR development. And then in 2015, I decided, okay, I need to move back to Singapore because I need a better environment startup environment for networking, to build partnerships, and to have people to cooperate with. And then in 2015, there was already in Singapore was a good VR startup buzz happening, and that's the good thing was because previously before I left Singapore on good terms. Like when I was unwinding the previous company, I had all bills were paid. I left on good terms with everyone. No one was angry with me, so it was a good thing. When I came back, everything was easygoing. It went smoothly. So then that's when I started the new company, and in 2016, I was starting to do my first VR projects. one of my first bigger projects there was for the TV show The Future is Wild, which is a show that was on Discovery Channel, and they also do exhibitions and all sorts of things, and they publish books and so forth. And so I had my first big project presented at MIPCOM in Cannes 2016, and then that led to more projects. And so step by step, I was getting more into VR development, and in Singapore, it was actually a good time to be in VR at that point, because there was an ecosystem that was supporting that. There's, for example, the Asia VR Association in Singapore, which is like a meetup where developers come together, where people show each other what they're working on, and new hardware gets tested. I speak there sometimes, and it's a great place to network and to find people to cooperate with. Then there's IMDA events, so Infocom and Media Development Authority of Singapore. They actually provide you with co-working space if you need it, if you have a good concept, for free. So if you want to develop something and you have a good concept and it sounds like a great idea, you get free office space. And there's regional cooperation there, because in Southeast Asia, these countries all network very well. And for example, the guys from HTC Vive from Taiwan come over very often. They actually have people in Singapore, so it's a good regional hub there. And coming back from Phnom Penh to Singapore, I actually had a different point of view this time when I came back, because Phnom Penh, on one hand, it was a great experience to do stuff there and to develop media projects. But on the other hand, it was really difficult to deal with the authorities there, because Cambodia is a very corrupt country. And when I closed my company in Cambodia, I had a tax audit. And having a tax audit in one of the most corrupt countries on the planet, in a language that you don't understand, that's probably the worst thing that can ever happen to you. So basically, it was great coming back to Singapore, because in Singapore there's no corruption. And that's a great thing, because in Asia that's a big problem. Look at any other country. Look at Indonesia, corruption is really bad. Thailand is horrible. Philippines is like, oh. So basically, Singapore is really an island without hardly any corruption. No corruption is very high on the list. And there's a rule of law. If someone owes you money, you're actually able to go after them, which is great. It has an educated workforce, availability of professional media services, and the business language is English, which is great. So for me, it was like I had a different perspective on Singapore coming back from Cambodia. But Singapore also has disadvantages. It's a tiny domestic market. So basically, if you develop something, if you develop a media product, you always have to think outside of Singapore, because Singapore is like only, 3.9 million people. It's like twice the size of Hamburg about. That means it's a tiny market. It's not even worth it. So if you want to produce, if you want to do a media production, you have to produce for a global audience or for a regional audience. Singapore is too small as a market. There's a lack of subculture, which I think is a disadvantage, because there's no underground, no subculture. It's very mainstream. It's the whole culture is geared towards mainstream. It's highly regulated, which means sometimes certain media types that you could run into problems. For example, in terms of censorship. For example, if your project would have something to do with LGBT things, you would run into censorship issues. It's a bit expensive, but I think you can avoid cost. And then there's a limited talent pool, because there's not so many people. It's just a small country. But then the benefits of Singapore is basically the region. So Singapore is a hub to the Southeast Asian region, and it's a bridge to China and its vibrant VR and tech startup scene. And that's what people see in Singapore, basically, that you can access all the markets around it. And China is very important. It's a good exchange between China and Singapore. Up here is one of the examples. There's like huge events in China in terms of VR especially. And VR is a big deal in China. They do things on a huge scale. Some examples here are, of course, first of all, HTC Vive. They have a lot of out-of-home entertainment centers there. They do a lot of stuff. Then there's a VR park in Guizhou. This one here, it's like a huge entertainment park. It's like a Disneyland, but it's based on VR. But it's a huge development. And these kind of things are happening all over China. They have big investments in VR. Another example is the VR zoo in Guangzhou, which is, I think, is a great idea. It's basically a zoo that's only in VR. So you have different rooms with different themes and different animal categories. And I think that's a brilliant idea, because this could be the zoo of the future. No animals get harmed, and you get really to study the animals up close. I think it's a fantastic concept. So basically, my personal takeaway from my journey through Asia is this. So first of all, number one is keep control of your business. So in the beginning, when I was taking on this venture capital, when I had these investors joining my company, so I basically, they took over the majority shares of my company. And so I was still the managing director, but they had the say basically, and I didn't like that. I didn't like that. I was, on one hand, I was calling the shots as a managing director, but on the other hand, I had the investors always telling me what to do, and I will never do that again. Because so it's either I like to have clear roles. Either I'm calling the shots, I'm the managing director, or I'm the employee, which is also great. If you're an employee, you know where you stand, you know what you do. So basically, I like to have a clear role. And this whole investment with people interfering, I wouldn't do that again. Because like when I did the first project that brought me to Asia, that the investors insisted on taking on this super high risk. I wouldn't have done that myself. I would have done it differently. I would have done it in smaller steps, but my investors insisted on taking on this huge risk. Then the other things, be flexible and open-minded. So in Asia, I learned to be super flexible about, to be open about jobs and job opportunities. I had to be, being outside of your own home turf, you have to be able to quickly pivot and be open to different kinds of jobs. And to be open-minded, you also have to learn to understand how people see you as a foreigner, and how to read people and to appreciate a different culture. So that kind of like is something that I think is positive. The other thing I learned is also take care of your network, because today I realize a lot of my jobs actually come through people that I've known for longer than 20 years. And when you first move outside, when you move to a different country, you think, okay, goodbye, who cares? But then in the end, it turns out that your old network is actually really important. And then the last point is fair play always wins. So that was like when I had to unwind the project in Singapore, I paid all my bills, I was fair to people. And then when I came back to Singapore, that turned out to be a good decision, because then everyone was friendly with me and there was no problem. So these are my personal takeaways. And then in terms of, in general, where I think the opportunities in Southeast Asia is for digital content creation entrepreneurs. There's a number of reasons to engage in that region. One is speed. So like for instance, in Singapore, you can set up a company in no time. It's super fast. You super quickly, you can set up a legal entity, employ people. It's very cost efficient to set up a company. It's scalable. The labor market is very liberal. There's good talent, and it's not only the quality of the talent. It's also the kind of, it's a different talent, you know, it's a different talent than in Europe. You have more cultural diversity. I mean, not more, you have a different kind of cultural diversity because especially if you want to develop for a global audience, that kind of cultural diversity that you have in Singapore, you know, where you have partially a Malay, Chinese, Indian, Western population, that kind of helps you to develop media products that are made for a global audience. So you have kind of like a microcosmos in Singapore. And then there's also some myths that need to be busted. One of them is the top talent is not always cheaper in Southeast Asia. So basically, some people think everything in Asia is cheaper, which is not true, because top talent is international. The people who are in the top row of, you know, digital artists, CG artists, these days that's a global scene. So people know what they're worth, and that even in Cambodia, like even in places in developing countries, if you're really good, you know where you stand, and people basically are not cheaper in Southeast Asia. But as I said, it's different kind of talent that you find there. And Southeast Asia is not always homogeneous, because very often people see Southeast Asia as just one big continent, you know, where this is almost like one big place. But in the end, it's not like that, because, you know, Southeast Asia is different countries with different cultures, different religions. So it's very fragmented. And if you produce media, that actually makes a difference, because it's different if you produce furniture. You know, for furniture, it really doesn't matter what language or people speak or what the religion is. But for media products, you know, where you have to deal with language and so forth, that's kind of important. So anyway, so I'm coming to the end. My line here is, "May the bluebird of happiness fly up your nose." There's another picture from Haw Par Villa, where I'm launching the Bluebird of Happiness into to the nose here. And I was actually looking this line up. Someone told me that's an old Chinese saying, but I looked it up and I found out it's actually a country and western song from the 60s. So never